Hello and welcome to this week's Primer Plus episode on the Battle of Lepanto. My name is Melissa Rihl and I'm a contributor for the Primer podcast. Today I'll be interviewing Professor Susan Hanssen, and she is an associate professor and chair of the history department at the University of Dallas, which is a small Catholic liberal arts college. For 20 years, she has taught American civilization on their Dallas campus and Western civilization on their Rome campus. And as the UD students cross from the Italian peninsula to Greece across the Adriatic by ferry, they chant Chesterton's resounding poem Lepanto as they sail over the site of the battle, the sunken ships and arms still unrecovered by maritime archaeology. A statue of Cervantes, the Spanish author who fought in the battle, greets students of history in the Bay of Lepanto. Dr. Hanssen received her PhD in British and American history from Rice University in Houston. She taught for the James Madison Fellowship at Georgetown and is a fellow of the James Madison Program in American Ideals and Institutions at Princeton. She has published on G.K. Chesterton and English patriotism, Henry Adams and the Adams family in the American intellectual tradition, and the history of liberal arts education. She has done so much, and we are so excited to have her with us today. Professor, thank you for joining us.
You're very welcome. Thank you very much for inviting me.
Yes. So as I mentioned, we're talking about the Battle of Lepanto this evening. So for those unfamiliar, can you please describe what the Battle of Lepanto was and why it was significant?
Okay, so perhaps the best way to just enter into thinking about the Battle of Lepanto is to realize that before 1492, Columbus sailing the ocean blue, and all of the great naval wars and naval battles that take place all across the Atlantic and the Pacific, right? So if we think of the Battle of the Atlantic in World War II, or we think of the Battle of the Pacific in World War II, maybe people have seen the movie Master and Commander, where you see Russell Crowe, as a British admiral being chased around South America from the Atlantic into the Pacific by a French frigate during the Napoleonic Wars, right? So modern history is full of a lot of great naval battles that take place globally, right? All around the world. But the Battle of Lepanto was the largest naval battle ever to take place in the Mediterranean, when the Mediterranean was considered the middle of Middle Earth, right? So literally the name Mediterranean, Medi-Terre, means Middle Earth, right? The battle for Middle Earth. And so the battle for Middle Earth, for people in the 1400s, right? People in the 1500s, the battle for Middle Earth was not a land battle. The battle for Middle Earth was a naval battle for control of the Mediterranean and all of the commercial routes all across the Mediterranean, which had sustained the growth of Western civilization ever since the Phoenician sailors had established, Carthage, right, and had fought over Sicily. So it's a battle for the control of the Mediterranean. So that's, I think, the first way of thinking about how important it is. And the second way of thinking about it is that it is a major turning point in the millennia, the 1,000 years long crusading struggle between the forces of Islam, diverse and complicated as those forces were, and Christian Europe, as diverse and complicated as Christian Europe was during the Middle Ages. So what had kind of come to a head in 1571 at the time of the Battle of Lepanto was that all of these diverse Muslim forces across North Africa and the Middle East had, for the first time, become united, right? So you had Barbary pirates in Morocco, in Libya, in what is, Tunisia. You had Egyptian Muslims, then you had Arab Muslims in the Middle East, you had Persian Muslims in what is now Iran, and then you had Turkish Muslims in Asia Minor. And so that was all, very diverse, and there's a lot of wars between them, right? At the same time, you have the rise of the Franks, you have the rise of the Ottonian Holy Roman Empire, you have the rise of English kings and the Scottish kings, and the different Christian republics and city-states in Italy. So that's all very diverse as well. So I don't want to make it sound like there's this monolithic Muslim power and this monolithic Christian power, because sometimes in order to get leverage in their own sphere, they would, cross over and create alliances, right, with different religious groups and ethnic groups. But just prior to the Battle of Lepanto, the world of Islam had become much more united under Suleiman the Magnificent, and had become what in the modern period, all the way up until World War I, is called the Ottoman Turk Empire. And the Ottoman Turk Empire had won a great land victory. They had won a great land victory in the East at the same time that the Christian forces, which had also become increasingly united under the Holy Roman Empire, had won a great victory in the West, right? So if you think about moving around in a kind of chess match around the Mediterranean, right? And ever since, right, the Muslims had tried to move from Spain, from Morocco into Spain, and then across the Pyrenees into France, right? Christian forces had been trying to push them back, right? So from the Battle of Tours, the Franks, before Charlemagne, are pushing the Muslim forces across the Pyrenees into Spain, right? And then pushing them down through Spain, literally from 732 all the way to 1492. So for 500 years, this battle is going on for the Spanish Peninsula, right? At the same time, the Byzantine Christian Empire in Asia Minor had also been battling Muslims, different Muslims, right? They're fighting Turkish Muslims. Over here, they're fighting a different dynasty. But nevertheless, there's a kind of chess match, right, on the land war, right, from this peninsula, right, right, across the Gibraltar Straits, across the Dardanelles Straits. Like, we'll go into Africa, you'll come into Europe, right, back and forth for the two exits of the Mediterranean, right, to control the eastern and the western exits of the Mediterranean, right. And so, in some sense, you could say in the 1400s, the century before the Battle of Lepanto, each side had won a great land victory.
Okay.
Right? So the Ottoman Turk Empire had taken the capital of Christian Byzantium. They had taken Constantinople, and it was now Istanbul. So 1453, Constantinople becomes Istanbul. I don't know if the audience remembers the song.
Oh yeah, I was just thinking that. I'm like, oh my goodness, yes.
I feel like it's very much an 80s thing, because I seem to recall that during the great Olympic struggles between the Soviet Union and the USA at the end of the Cold War, a lot of the Russian figure skaters used to like to skate to Constantinople, as Istanbul. Yeah. So it's very popular in the 80s. So they had just taken Constantinople, which became Istanbul, and it still is today, right? So that's huge, right? That's historic, right?
Yeah.
It's something that completely changes, right? Constantinople since Constantine, right, becomes Istanbul to today, right? Mm-hmm. So that's important. Meanwhile, all of the different kingdoms of Spain, the multiple Spanish-speaking Christian kingdoms, had intermarried, right, and conquered each other until the last piece of the puzzle, the kingdom of Aragon and the kingdom of Castile, came together to form Spain and managed to defeat the Muslims at the Battle of Granada in 1492. Yeah. It's an easy date to remember because it's only the success right? at Columbus, right? Yeah. So it's only the success at the gates of Granada that enables King and Queen Ferdinand and Isabella to fund Christopher Columbus's voyage
Okay.
because of their success.
Yeah.
So they had taken the rest of Spain, right? In some sense, Spain is created out of the alliance structure that is created to expel the Muslim power from Spain, right?
Mm.
So you had these two battles, right? Victory over here, right? Victory over here. But it just goes to show you that land victories are just not as important as naval victories, right? Because for them, naval victories were what air power, right, and what communications and commerce power is, right? It's your road of communication, right? So in the world before railroads, in the world before cars and trucks and planes, right? If you control shipping, then you control all communications and commerce. So in some sense, the 1400s is a draw. And you have these two powers, the Holy Roman Empire and the Ottoman Turk Empire, going head to head in the Mediterranean for the greatest naval battle before the modern period, before Christopher Columbus's voyage. So it's a united Muslim army, and then a band of brothers, right? An eclectic alliance of different Christian forces. There are ships from Venice. There are ships from the Kingdom of Naples. There are ships from the Spanish. There are ships from the Genoese. And there's a Vatican fleet as well. So it's a little, band of brothers operation, right? Where there's different commanders with their different groups of ships, and they're, having to kind of negotiate, how are we going to go into battle? And the leader of this quirky band is actually the bastard son of Charles V, the Holy Roman Emperor.
Oh, whoa.
Charles V, the Holy Roman Emperor, did not lead that great naval battle himself, right?
Wow.
It was led by one of his sons, by one of his many mistresses, whose name was Don Juan de Austria, right? Don John of Austria. And he led the Christian forces to victory in the Battle of Lepanto, which took place between the Greek peninsula and the Italian peninsula. And so, of course, the Italian peninsula is the central peninsula of the Mediterranean.
Right.
If you control the Italian peninsula and Sicily, right, then you really have great control over the Mediterranean. Just for example, America has, the United States of America has a large naval base in Naples even today, right? So yeah. It's just geography doesn't change from century to century, and certain geographic features remain important no matter what. So yeah, it's central, it's big, it's important, right? It's probably the turning point of the Crusades. The Crusades are not finished after that, because even after that, great land battles continue. The Muslims surround Vienna, even as late as 1683.
Wow.
At the time that William and Mary College is already founded, the alma mater of Thomas Jefferson.
Yeah.
The Muslims are at the gates of Vienna. So there are land battles afterwards that are important. But really, the Battle of Lepanto is the linchpin, the turning point of that great struggle.
So as you talked about the band of brothers of, the Christian forces versus the United Islamic forces,
right,
were they outnumbered as far as ships and artillery? And, what was that situation like?
Yeah. So the Christian forces were outnumbered, but they had planned a little bit of a surprise. Okay. They were incredibly well armed. So they had actually weighed down their ships with an incredible tonnage of cannon, which made it so that their ships were less maneuverable and less fast. But once they got in position, they had enough artillery to do very serious damage. And so the basic battle formation of the Battle of Lepanto is a crescent formation for the Ottoman Turk Navy, and the Christian Navy led by Don John of Austria kind of moving into that crescent, right? Almost as if they're going to be surrounded, right? But they've got these heavy ships in the water with an unexpected and unusual amount of artillery.
I mean, in a certain sense, I don't know if you've seen the Pirates of the Caribbean movie, but as you're describing it, I'm thinking about, this like small little pirate army, going through the British Army. So is there significance to the crescent shape for the Islamic forces because of, I know, I mean, it's a star and a crescent moon, correct?
Right.
So
it's the symbol of the Ottoman Turk Empire.
Yeah.
But I think it was more strategic. They thought they could surround the fleet, right?
Okay.
So this battle, which I think a lot of Americans don't really know much about, is very central to the thinking of the people in the 1500s. The day that it was fought is sometimes referred to as the Feast of Our Lady of Victory. Sometimes it's referred to as the Feast of Our Lady of the Rosary, because the Pope at the time had asked Christians, right, in whatever land they lived in, to pray the Rosary for the victory of Christendom that would save the Italian peninsula from being overrun by Muslim forces. And that was a very serious danger because the Muslim forces had attacked a number of the little republics up the coast of Italy. So, if you go to Italy, I mean, everybody loves, these are, great, to go to a beach resort on the Adriatic. Everybody loves one of these, all the buildings are white and they're kind of tiered down the cliffs to the, to the ocean. So they're spectacularly beautiful, right? But so Bari and Otranto, right? And all of these little independent republics, right? There was no such thing as the unified state of Italy at the time, right? So they had been attacked by Muslim forces, as had Venice and Venetian ships. And when they took control of one of those cities, the city of Otranto, they insisted on mass conversions of all of the people in Otranto. Yeah. And Pope Francis just recently canonized the 70 martyrs of Otranto who chose death rather than to give up their faith in Christ at that time. So there was a serious possibility that Italy could be overrun just as Greece and Asia Minor had been overrun by the Ottoman Turk forces.
Wow. So October 7th is the day, right?
Yes.
That's the day.
October 7th, 1571.
Yes. So it wasn't just a one-day battle though, right? Like did this went on for weeks?
Actually, no, it was a from sunrise to sunset
battle.
I mean, this was pretty fast. Once they sailed into sight of each other, they fought it out, and declared victory by the end of the day. The shout of a victory came up from the Christian ships, and in fact, Don John of Austria is buried in Spain, I believe in Barcelona. His tomb says that he is the natural son of Charles V, meaning he's not the legitimate son. And in that church, they have the prow of his ship that was, and there's a large black crucifix that was kind of his symbol as they went into battle. So it's actually, it's part of modern history, right? It's not antiquity, it's only 500 years ago. And so we have lots of records. One time in the Vatican archives, I saw Queen Elizabeth's letter to the Pope congratulating him on the victory at Lepanto.
Oh.
So, we have a lot of records of the event. We have eyewitness accounts. As we mentioned at the beginning, the great poet and novelist, Spanish poet and novelist Cervantes fought in the Battle of Lepanto. So we have eyewitness memories of the battle. Yeah.
So just, I guess, more of a technical question when it comes to the battles, if they're going back and forth for centuries leading up to this, land wars and then over the sea, how did they communicate, hey, this is the day we're coming at you, we're going to fight to the death over this? Did they send letters, I guess,
Right.
versus
Yeah.
mock?
Well, I think a lot of it involves a kind of medieval form of espionage, right? Trying to find out where the Muslim force is grouping, right, and how large it is, and trying to rally all of the different Christian fleets together at the same spot, and then trying to arrange an encounter. So the Muslim Navy had just been leaving what's called the Bay of Lepanto, and so they met on the high seas outside of the Bay of Lepanto, right?
Oh my goodness. Okay, so you mentioned Our Lady of Victories as a popular title for the Blessed Virgin Mary that came from this battle, and you referred to why she's closely related to this battle, but why do you think that in particular is a devotion within, especially I know for Catholics, a devotion that has kind of sustained until this day?
So the long centuries long struggle between the Christian West and the variety of Muslim forces in the Middle East really began with the capture and of the Holy Land and the sacred places in Jerusalem that were associated with Christ's life. In particular, the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, which was Christ's tomb, from which he rose, and Calvary. These had been Christian sites that had been pilgrimage sites from very early on in Christian life. I mean, in the 300s, we already have the Emperor Constantine's mother going in search of trying to find the true cross, trying to find the manger in which Christ was born. And so the tradition of going on pilgrimage to visit the sites where Jesus actually lived, which was very important for distinguishing Jesus Christ as God from the mythic gods of the ancient world, to kind of emphasize that he's an actual historical character, right, who lived at a particular moment in a particular place. And so to go visit that place was very important to emphasize that he's not like Apollo or Zeus or right, these mythic gods. And so when Jerusalem was captured by Muslim forces, initially they did allow the continuation of Christian pilgrimages there, but in the infighting between different Muslim forces, there different powers came to the fore in Jerusalem and destroyed the Holy Sepulchre, the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, and made it much more difficult for Christians to go on pilgrimage to the Holy Land. And so both the practice of the Stations of the Cross and the practice of the Holy Rosary are kind of responses to the fact that Christians couldn't go on pilgrimage to the Holy Land anymore. And so to reflect on Christ's life, to walk the path that Christ took from the place where he was condemned by Pontius Pilate, along the way of the cross, to Calvary where he was crucified. If you couldn't do it in the Holy Land, well, you could walk it in prayer around your church, right? Or if you couldn't reflect on the mysteries of Christ's life, his incarnation in Nazareth, his birth in Bethlehem, his resurrection in Jerusalem, his walk on the road to Emmaus, with his disciples after his resurrection. If you couldn't do that in the Holy Land on pilgrimage, you could at least ponder these things in your heart, right? And that's the phrase that the Gospels use about Mary, that she pondered these things in her heart. And so the practice of the Rosary as a kind of alternative to pilgrimage became very important. So it was already associated with the struggle to connect, right, with the time and the place of Christ's life on earth.
Okay, so it was, I think it was it Pope Pius V at the time of the Battle of Lepanto? So he was inviting the faithful to pray the Rosary.
Mhm.
So is that also why then they go from saying, okay, Our Lady of Victory is also known as Our Lady of the Rosary for that particular day?
Right. Yes. Yeah. So it's like it's a dual name, right? Our Lady of Victory, Our Lady of the Rosary. Through the Rosary, we gained the victory. And there's even a story that Pope Pius V was in his chapel praying at the moment of the battle, and that he came out of his chapel to say that victory had been won, even before news had come, across the ocean and all the way to Rome, that he was either had a vision of the victory, or that he was confident that God had heard the prayers of Christendom through the hands of the Blessed Mother.
Yeah,
So,
which is amazing, because just
right.
that distance of, oh, okay, there's no text messages coming through.
Yeah. It takes you a day to drive and then a day on the ferry to get there. So if
Wow.
you knew they had won, and that's nowadays. So
Yeah.
yeah.
Oh my goodness. So by the time everyone else kind of heard the official news, like,
Mhm.
okay, we've come out victorious.
Right.
How long did that take?
Well, I think it within a week or so, it reaches probably Venice, and then
Okay.
spreads, right? I mean, obviously there are ambassadors and diplomats, in a kind of network all across Europe at the time, right?
So was it a pretty immediate shift then, like with this victory, as far as the impacts of the Islamic forces and
Yeah. Before the Battle of Lepanto, in 1571, the Ottoman Turk Empire had the aspiration of turning the Mediterranean Sea into a completely Muslim sea. They said a sea on which no Christian ship could sail, right? And they just made shipping very dangerous, right? And very expensive, and and the insurance for your shipping went way up. So I mean, this was a problem. Islamic pirates in the Mediterranean is a problem even at the beginning of American history. The Adams family, John Adams and John Quincy Adams, are adamant that we needed to build a navy. It was something that Thomas Jefferson had to deal with, the issue of the Barbary pirates attacking American shipping when they were no longer protected by the British Navy. So that was very problematic. But after 1571, the Battle of Lepanto, it took a long time for the Ottoman Turk Empire to recover from that naval battle. Building ships was expensive, and to recover from that, from the destruction of that navy, took them a long time.
wow. So in looking at the entirety of all of this, and as you mentioned, there are some great historical pieces that have come out from this, as well as G.K. Chesterton's poem of Lepanto. So why is that such a big part of, especially when you bring your students over there?
Yes. So I did begin life as a British historian. I didn't primarily start out teaching Western civilization and thinking about the centrality of 1571 and the naval battle of Lepanto for kind of the fate of Western civilization and Christian Europe. I started out life as a British historian, very interested in World War I and World War II. very interested in how I'd say the hobbits of England managed to defeat the Mordor of fascism. So it's not really okay to make such a simplistic historical appropriation of Tolkien's magnificent poetic work, but that's how I got into it, and I realized that G.K. Chesterton was very important for developing an understanding of what it meant to be English, and being attached to freedom, and to all of the little simple pleasures that freedom gives. Having a beer at the pub with your friends, and gardening, pottering about in your garden, right? And as George Orwell says, biking to Holy Communion in a misty morning, right? These things that are just sort of the simple pleasures of life, right? And so I realized that Chesterton was very important for developing that vision of the English and their love for freedom. And so I knew Chesterton's poem Lepanto, which this idea of a band of brothers, right, fighting a great and united and overpowering force, right? Chesterton, in writing his poem Lepanto, was actually using Lepanto as a metaphor for what's happening in the 20th century.
Right.
Just as in some ways Tolkien's great novel it's a metaphor for this, the struggle of a band of brothers, right? The Scots and the French resistance, and the escaped Polish, fighters, and the Americans and the Canadians, right, against, Nazi Germany. The idea of a band of brothers, a kind of motley band, right, all speaking with different accents, and coming from different places. I mean, I think when we watch Saving Private Ryan, right? You've got the evangelical kid from Iowa, and the Jewish kid from Brooklyn, New York, and it's a motley band of brothers. But there's one thing that they all agree on, and that is freedom. So Chesterton, when he wrote Lepanto, wasn't primarily thinking about the struggle between the Muslim forces and the Christian forces. For him, Christian Europe had become very secularized. And at his time, the Ottoman Turk Empire was no longer a massive world power. So he wasn't primarily concerned with that struggle. He was using it as a metaphor for what the Free West would go through in the 20th century, dealing with totalitarianism. So he brings back, right, something that had been kind of going out of style, which is a kind of resounding martial poetry, which I think to the modern ear can sound a little unpolitically correct because of its rhythm. It's kind of martial rhythm. What sometimes when they're referring to Homer's Greek, they call the galloping hexameter, right? Like a horse galloping. So the beginning of Chesterton's poem talks about how the Sultan in the Ottoman Turk Empire has taken over Constantinople and turned it into Istanbul, right? And so the beginning of the poem starts with this paradox that there's a Sultan of Byzantium, right? And that he's smiling a kind of smug smile, realizing, right, that there's no great leader of the Christians to come that can match him and would come against him, right? So it begins, white founts falling in the courts of the sun, and the Sultan of Byzantium is smiling as they run. There is laughter like the fountains in that face of all men feared. It stirs the forest darkness, the darkness of his beard. It curls the blood-red crescent, the crescent of his lips, for the inmost sea of all the earth is shaken with his ships. And I think that phrase, the inmost sea of all the earth is shaken with his ships, is actually a wonderful little poetic tag, poetic phrase to kind of capture the situation. And then you have this idea that there's really no comparable leader on the Christian side. And so they have to look for Don John of Austria, who is an illegitimate son of the Holy Roman Emperor. He doesn't have a throne, he doesn't have a crown, and he takes up the charge. Even though the Pope has asked England for help, has asked Spain for help, has asked France for help, but he's not getting what he needs. So he needs to put together a motley crew. So let's see where we can pick up the poem. It says, in that enormous silence, tiny and unafraid, comes up along a winding road the noise of the crusade. Strong gongs groaning as the guns boom far. Don John of Austria is going to the war. Stiff flags straining in the night blast cold, in the gloom black purple, in the glint old gold. Torchlight crimson on the copper kettle drums, and the tuckets and the trumpets and the cannon, and he comes. Don John laughing and the brave beard curled, spurning of his stirrups like the thrones of all the world, holding his head up as a flag of all the free. Love light of Spain, hurrah, death light of Africa. Don John of Austria is riding to the sea. Right? So it's a very resounding poem. It's a lot of fun to do as a group. But that part is very visual. Chesterton never went to university. He was an artist. And so it's very visual and very colorful. And it evokes the Baroque paintings, which are very dark, but then the glints of gold, right? In the darkness and the vivid reds, that we associate with Caravaggio, right? So there's the kind of, he's attempting to create the Baroque atmosphere of the era of Lepanto.
Wow, that's awesome. Thank you so much. I am impressed. Do you have the whole thing memorized?
I only have the first verse memorized, but I have students who have the whole thing memorized.
Wow, that's awesome.
Yeah.
So just as we kind of get ready to close here, what are some significant historical takeaways that one could take from this battle?
I think one very important thing is that, as I said before, there are certain geographical features. There are certain elements that don't change very much from century to century. And so if there's a concern about land war, but also naval war, diplomatic alliances, as well as artillery, right? That when you're looking at a major world event that transforms things, it's a very complicated arena, right? You need to get to know the cast of characters, right, on either side. There's usually a lot of struggling and infighting and, different plans and plans going awry and people dying at the last minute. And then you need to get a new leader and, so it's very complicated. And yet, once you kind of dig into the historical world, you start to get an eye for, if you're looking at the Civil War, you also need to look at land battles. But just because Gettysburg is incredibly important, you don't want to forget about what's happening with regard to the Navy and the diplomatic struggles, the different personnel struggles within Lincoln's government with regard to, slavery and abolition. So historical events are very complicated, and so. Even in a battle that's like the Battle of Lepanto, that's so somehow gives you a sense of crisp, clear historical before and after, and it's transformative. As soon as you get close to the ground, history becomes incredibly complex, right?
Yeah. Wonderful. So thank you so much, Professor, for joining us. Is there anything else that we have forgotten to touch on this battle?
Yeah, I just would like to say that there are a couple of books, a very old book called Mohammed and Charlemagne by Henri Pirenne, which it's an old classic. It's not an up-to-date history book, but it gives the sense of how central this struggle has been to the European imagination. Okay. And then more recently, Niccolo Caponi has a book that is very detailed with regard to the blow by blow, ship by ship, gun by gun, officer by officer, and that's called The Victory of the West. And so if people wanted to pursue, either the imaginative place that Lepanto has, right, in the identity of the West, or the details of battle, those are two places that they could go, Henri Pirenne and Niccolo Caponi.
Wonderful. So we will definitely link those on our continued study show notes, as well as a link to Chesterton's poem. So thank you to everyone for listening to this week's Primer Plus episode. If you liked this episode, please subscribe, leave us a 5-star review, and tell a friend. For more information and to find the episode notes and additional ammunition, please go to personalprimer.com. Thank you so much, Professor.
Yes, you're very welcome. Thank you.